There are moments in war when the mathematics of survival collapse into something approaching zero, when the calculations that generals make in clean rooms with maps and coffee become irrelevant against the cold physics of steel and fire. August 7th, 1944, in the dense fog of Mortain, was such a moment. Sergeant Robert Callahan and the men of Company A, 823rd Tank Destroyer Battalion, stood behind towed 3-inch guns that could not move fast enough to save them, facing an armored wave that should have crushed them into the French soil within minutes. What happened in that fog was not supposed to be possible. Stay with this story, because what these men did in the blindness of that morning would echo across the entire Normandy campaign, and the world would never know how close it came to unraveling. The fog arrived before the Germans did. It rolled into the Mortain sector like a living thing, thick and cold, smelling of wet earth and the smoke of distant fires. By 0300 hours, visibility had collapsed to 15 feet. A man could stand at his gun and not see the foxhole 20 yards away. The world had shrunk to a circle of gray mist, and beyond that circle, anything could be waiting. Sergeant Robert Callahan stood in that fog, listening. In this kind of darkness, listening was all you had. Every sound became magnified, distorted by the moisture in the air, the drip of water from leaves, the distant rumble that might be thunder or artillery, the creak of equipment as men shifted position, trying to stay warm in the August cold that arrived with the fog. The 3-inch M5 gun behind him was a monument to a dying doctrine, towed, not mounted on tracks, not self-propelled. When you fired this weapon, you had to stay exactly where you were exposed, while every German tank within a mile turned its attention to the flash of your muzzle. Then you had to limber up, hitch the gun to a truck, and pray you could move before the return fire found you. The entire process, if everything went perfectly, took 30 seconds. Under fire, with shaking hands and the sound of incoming rounds, it took longer. Sometimes it took too long. The doctrine said these guns could be displaced rapidly. The doctrine was written by men who had never done it under fire, men who had never felt the ground shake as an 88mm shell hit 20 feet away, men who had never tried to hook a 2-ton gun to a truck while machine gun tracers searched for you in the darkness. Callahan had done it. He had done it in North Africa, where at least you could see what was trying to kill you. He had done it in Sicily, where the hills gave you options. But here, in this fog, with radio silence imposed to prevent the Germans from triangulating their positions, he felt something new. Not fear exactly. He had made peace with fear long ago. This was something colder. The understanding that immobility in the face of armor was not a tactical disadvantage. It was a death sentence waiting to be carried out. His crew was quiet. They had learned not to talk when there was nothing useful to say. Private First Class Eddie Kowalski, the gunner, sat with his hand resting on the traversing wheel, staring into the fog as though he could will it to lift. Kowalski was 22 years old, from Chicago, and before the war he had worked in a steel mill. He understood machines, understood stress and metal fatigue, understood that everything had a breaking point. He had seen that breaking point in North Africa, when a round from a German 88 had hit the ground near their position, and the shockwave alone had killed a man 50 feet away. Internal organs ruptured by pressure, without a mark on his body. Corporal James Hernandez checked the ammunition for the 4th time that hour, his hands moving with the automatic precision of ritual. Each round weighed 30 pounds. Each one had to be loaded, aimed, fired within seconds. Hernandez was from Texas, had grown up hunting deer with his father, and he treated ammunition with the reverence of a man who understood that every shot mattered. In training, they had talked about rates of fire, about how many rounds per minute a good crew could manage. In combat, you did not think about rates of fire. You thought about making each shot count because you might not get another chance. Private William Chen stood near the truck, smoking a cigarette cupped in his palm so the glow would not give them away. Chen was the youngest of them, 19, born in San Francisco to parents who had immigrated from Guangdong province. When the war started, his family had been sent to an internment camp. Chen had volunteered anyway, had argued with the recruitment officer until they let him sign the papers. He never talked about why. Some things went too deep for words. They were good men. They had followed Callahan through 2 campaigns. They trusted him to make the decisions that would keep them alive. And tonight, Callahan had no decisions to make. Tonight, they could only wait and hope that when the moment came, training and instinct would be enough. The intelligence had been sparse and contradictory, which meant it was probably accurate. The Germans were massing armor to the east, not a probe, not a local counterattack, something bigger. The word that kept appearing in the hasty briefings was counteroffensive. Operation Lüttich, someone had called it. Callahan did not speak German, but he understood the implications. 4 panzer divisions, maybe 200 tanks. The numbers were estimates, but even if they were half wrong, the mathematics remained untenable. Company A had 6 guns, 6 3-inch towed guns, against 200 tanks. The briefing had taken place in a farmhouse cellar that still smelled of wine and old potatoes. The battalion commander, a lieutenant colonel whose name was already fading from memory, had spread maps across a table and pointed to the relevant terrain features with fingers that did not shake. He had explained the situation with the calm detachment of a man describing someone else's problem. The Germans were going to attack. They were going to attack here at Mortain because Mortain was where the American line was thinnest. They were going to try to drive to the coast, to Avranches, to cut off Patton's advance and restore their defensive line. The American task was simple: delay them, hold them, buy time for reinforcements to arrive and for air power to be brought to bear. How long? As long as possible. What support would they have? Artillery when weather permitted, air observation, air support when the fog lifted. Infantry, what little could be spared. The rest was up to them. Someone had asked the obvious question. What were 6 towed guns supposed to do against 4 panzer divisions? The colonel had looked at the questioner with tired eyes and said that they were supposed to do their jobs. That was all. The briefing had ended, and the crews had walked back to their positions through the darkness, each man alone with his thoughts, each man doing the math and coming to the same conclusion. But there was geography to consider, and geography could matter more than numbers if you understood it correctly. Hill 314 rose behind the American positions like the spine of some ancient creature. Whoever held that hill could see for miles when the weather was clear, could direct artillery onto any target in the valley. The Americans held it. Barely. A mixed force of infantry and artillery observers, dug in and supplied by men who crawled up the slopes in darkness. If the Germans took Mortain, they could roll up the entire American flank, drive to the coast, cut off Patton's Third Army, and turn the Normandy breakout into a disaster. Hill 314 was not just terrain. It was the hinge upon which the entire campaign could swing. Callahan knew this in the abstract way that sergeants know the strategic picture. But his war was not abstract. His war was the gun, the crew, the fog, and the sound that was growing louder in the darkness. A deep mechanical growl. Engines, plural, moving slowly, cautiously, feeling their way through the fog like predators uncertain of their footing. He raised his hand and his crew froze. Kowalski swung the gun slightly, instinct guiding him toward the sound. Hernandez moved 2 rounds closer, ready. Chen dropped his cigarette and ground it out with his boot, then moved to the truck, ready to hitch and run if they survived the next 5 minutes. The sound grew, not one engine, many. The distinctive rattle and clank of track links, the high whine of transmissions under strain, panzers, moving in column, which meant they could not see any better than the Americans could. Blind. The Germans were advancing blind into an enemy position they could not locate. It was madness. It was also exactly what desperate commanders ordered when the stakes were high enough. Callahan could see nothing. The fog pressed against his eyes like a physical weight. But the sound told him everything he needed to know. They were close, 50 yards, maybe less. He waited. Every instinct screamed to fire to hit them before they hit you, but Callahan had learned a harder lesson. The first shot gave away your position. The first shot was a coin flip. You might kill a tank. You might miss. Either way, every gun in the German column would know exactly where you were. The smart play was to wait until you were sure, to let them come closer, to fire when the target was so close that missing was impossible, and then to run like your life depended on it, because it did. The first shape materialized out of the fog like a ghost taking form. Low, angular, massive. A panther. Callahan felt his chest tighten. The Panther was not just a tank. It was a statement of engineering philosophy, a 75mm gun mounted on sloped armor that could shrug off most American rounds at anything beyond point-blank range. The 3-inch M5 could penetrate a Panther if you hit it in the side or rear at close range. Frontally, you were gambling. The math said you needed to be inside 300 yards. In this fog, 300 yards might as well be 3 feet. Panther rolled forward blind, its commander probably standing in the turret hatch trying to see through the murk. Behind it more shapes, another Panther, a Panzer IV. Infantry moving alongside the tanks, Panzer grenadiers with machine pistols and grenades staying close to the armor for protection. Callahan counted them in his head. Not because the numbers mattered tactically, but because counting kept him calm. 12, 15, 20 men. One of them coughed. Another whispered something in German. They were close enough to hear voices. Kowalski looked at Callahan, his eyes asking the question. Callahan shook his head. Not yet. The Panther was almost parallel to their position now, 15 yards away, close enough to hit with a thrown rock. Its exhaust stank of diesel and oil. The track links clanked and squealed, and still Callahan waited, because there was a second Panther behind the first, and if they killed the lead tank, the second would fire blind into the fog and probably hit them through sheer chance. Better to wait. Better to let the first one pass, aim for the second, and hope the confusion bought them the seconds they needed to displace. But the decision was taken out of his hands. Somewhere to the north, another gun crew did not wait. The night split open with a crack of high-velocity fire, and the fog lit up orange. Someone had taken the shot. The Germans reacted instantly. The Panther in front of Callahan's position swung its turret toward the sound, and Callahan knew they had maybe 3 seconds before the entire column opened fire. He slapped Kowalski on the shoulder, and Kowalski fired without hesitation. The M5 gun bucked and roared, the muzzle flash a brief sun in the fog. The round hit the Panther in the side just behind the turret, and there was a sound like a hammer hitting a bell. Armor piercing. It went through. For a moment nothing happened. Then the Panther lurched, stopped, and hatches flew open as crew bilayed out, silhouettes against the firelight beginning to bloom inside their tank. Callahan was already yelling, "Move, move, move." Hernandez and Chen ran for the truck, hooking the trails to the hitch while Kowalski grabbed the ready ammunition. 30 seconds. That was the goal. Shoot and be gone in 30 seconds. They had 20. The second Panther fired blind, its 88mm gun sending a round screaming over their heads, so close Callahan felt the pressure wave. The truck engine roared to life, Chen behind the wheel, and the gun jerked forward, trails bouncing over the rough ground. Callahan threw himself onto the back of the truck as it accelerated, and behind them the world became fire and noise. Machine gun tracers whipped through the fog, searching. High explosive rounds detonated in the trees. The Germans were firing at everything, at nothing, at ghosts. They made it 200 yards before Callahan ordered Chen to stop. There was no point in running farther. The fog was everywhere and every position was equally exposed. They unlimbered the gun again, hands shaking now, adrenaline turning into exhaustion. Kowalski was breathing hard, his face pale. Hernandez was bleeding from a cut on his forehead, probably hit by debris, but he ignored it. Chen killed the engine and jumped out, ready to do it all over again. And the night was full of guns firing now, American and German, muzzle flashes blinking in the fog like fireflies. Each one a brief moment of light followed by darkness and the thunder of impact. The fog played tricks. Sound had no direction. A tank engine to the east might be 100 yards away or 1,000. The scream of incoming shells could be right on top of you or headed for someone else entirely. Callahan learned to trust only what he could see, and he could see almost nothing. The crew fought by instinct, by muscle memory, by the trust they had built in 2 years of war. When shapes appeared, they fired. When the fog swallowed the world again, they moved. Shoot, displace, shoot, displace, the rhythm of survival. But survival had a cost. By 0430, Callahan had lost count of how many times they had fired. 8 rounds, maybe 9. He had no idea how many hits they had scored. In the fog, you fired at shapes and sounds, and the results were swallowed by darkness. What he did know was that the German advance had not stopped. If anything, it was growing. More engines, more voices. The fog carried the sound of wounded men screaming, German and American both, the universal language of pain. Somewhere to the south, a gun position fell silent mid-engagement, which meant the crew was dead or running. The line was collapsing. Callahan had been in enough battles to recognize the sound of defeat. It had a particular quality, a hollowness, a space where answering fire should be but was not. Another gun crew gone. That made 3, maybe 4. Half of Company A erased in less than 2 hours. The survivors were being forced to cover wider and wider sectors, and soon the gaps would be too large to cover at all. A panzer grenadier stumbled out of the fog not 10 feet from their position, his machine pistol hanging loose, his face pale with shock. For a moment he and Callahan stared at each other, 2 men equally surprised, equally uncertain. Then Hernandez shot him with a carbine, 3 quick shots, and the German fell without a sound. They dragged the body into a ditch and went back to the gun. There was no time for anything else. No time to check if the man was truly dead. No time to search for documents or weapons. No time to process what had just happened. The fog had become a place where the living and the dead existed in the same uncertain space, where you could kill a man and forget about it 30 seconds later because the next threat was already materializing out of the gray. And then, impossibly, the fog began to lift, not quickly, not cleanly, but in ragged patches, the sky lightening from black to gray, visibility stretching from 15 feet to 30, then 50. Dawn was coming. Callahan did not know if that was good or bad. In daylight, they could see the Germans, but the Germans could see them too, and the Germans had more tanks. The lifting fog revealed a battlefield that looked nothing like the clean lines on the maps in the briefing. It was chaos, burning vehicles. Dead men scattered like broken dolls, shell craters filled with water, and everywhere movement, tanks, infantry, the grinding, relentless advance of an army that had been told to reach the coast no matter the cost. The first clear view of the battlefield was worse than anything Callahan had imagined. Panthers and Panzer IVs were scattered across the fields like broken toys, some burning, some abandoned but most still moving, grinding forward through the mud and wire. There were dozens of them, and behind the tanks on foot came the Panzer Grenadiers, hundreds of infantry moving in loose formations, using the fog banks that still clung to the low ground as cover. The American line was a thin string of gun positions and foxholes, already broken in places, the survivors falling back toward Hill 314 because there was nowhere else to go. Callahan saw another M5 gun crew trying to displace under fire. He watched as a Panther rotated its turret with mechanical precision and fired once. The truck exploded, flipping end over end, and the gun cartwheeled into a ditch. No one got out. He looked away. There was no time to mourn. The only way to honor the dead was to keep fighting. The sound of Sherman tanks changed everything. They came from the west, from the 743rd Tank Battalion, a company of them maybe, their engines roaring, their 75mm guns firing on the move. They were outnumbered and outgunned by the Panthers, but they were moving, and movement was life. The Shermans hit the German flank, and for a moment the Panzer advance faltered. Not stopped, faltered. It was enough. Callahan's crew fired 3 more rounds, hitting a Panzer IV in the track, immobilizing it. The German tank kept firing, turret traversing, looking for targets, but it was stuck, and a stuck tank was a dead tank. Within minutes, American artillery found it, and it disappeared in a column of smoke and flame. The Shermans pressed forward, trading shots with the Panthers at ranges where neither side had a clear advantage. It was brutal. 2 Shermans died in as many minutes, their armor no match for the German guns. but they bought time. And in this battle, time was the only currency that mattered. The fog lifted fully by 0600 hours, and with the light came the Republic P-47 Thunderbolts. Callahan heard them before he saw them, the deep roar of radial engines, and then they were there, diving out of the pale morning sky, rockets and bombs falling onto the German columns. The Panthers scattered, trying to find cover in the hedgerows and villages, but there was no cover from the air. The Thunderbolts came in waves, strafing, bombing, turning the roads into rivers of fire. The German advance did not stop, but it slowed. It bent, it bled. Callahan watched a Thunderbolt take a direct hit from anti-aircraft fire, the plane coming apart in the air, pieces tumbling down like leaves. The pilot did not bail out. There was not enough time. The wreckage hit the ground half a mile away, and the war moved on without pausing. This was the calculus of modern battle. Lives spent for minutes gained for hours bought. Hours bought for a chance, however slim, that the line would hold. By 0800 hours, the Germans had pushed into Mortain itself. Callahan could see the fighting from his position on the edge of the town. American infantry in desperate close quarters combat with panzer grenadiers, buildings burning, tanks firing down streets at point-blank range. It was chaos. It was slaughter. But Hill 314 still held. The artillery observers on the hill were calling down fire missions constantly, and every German attempt to take the high ground was shattered by American shells. The hill was the key. As long as it held, the Germans could not see, could not coordinate, could not exploit any breakthrough they managed. Callahan's gun crew was down to 4 rounds. Kowalski's hands were burned from handling hot brass. Hernandez was limping, his ankle twisted in the last displacement. Chen had stopped talking entirely, his face locked in a mask of exhaustion. They had been fighting for 5 hours. It felt like 5 years, and the Germans were still coming. A Panther appeared at the edge of a tree line 200 yards away, its gun traversing toward Callahan's position. There was no time to displace, no time to run. Kowalski fired, and the round hit low, ricocheting off the glacis plate in a shower of sparks. The Panther fired back. The round passed so close to Callahan that he felt the heat of it, and then it hit the ground behind the gun and detonated. The blast picked him up and threw him 6 feet. He landed hard, ears ringing, vision blurred. When he tried to stand, his legs would not work. He looked down and saw blood, but he could not tell if it was his or someone else's. Hernandez was screaming something. Callahan could not hear the words, but he understood the meaning. The gun was damaged. The recoil mechanism was broken, hydraulic fluid leaking into the dirt. Without the recoil system, firing the gun would tear it apart. It was done. They were done. Hernandez was pulling him toward the truck, and Callahan let himself be pulled because there was nothing else to do. They piled into the back, Chen driving, and they fled south toward Hill 314, the last American position in the sector. The hill was surrounded, not encircled but close. German tanks prowled the base like wolves around a wounded animal, testing, probing, looking for weakness. But every time they tried to advance up the slopes, artillery from positions miles away dropped curtains of fire on them, and they pulled back. The Americans on the hill were cut off, low on ammunition, low on food, low on everything except determination. They held because there was no choice. If they ran, they died. If they stayed, they might die, but they might also live. And living meant the Germans did not win. Callahan and his crew made it to the hill by 0900 hours. They climbed on foot, leaving the truck and the broken gun behind, carrying what ammunition they had left for the infantry. At the top, they found a scene from hell. Foxholes full of wounded men, stacks of bodies covered with shelter halves, a battery of 105mm howitzers firing non-stop, the gun crews working like machines, faces black with powder smoke. The commanding officer, a major whose name Callahan never learned, looked at him with red-rimmed eyes and pointed to a sector of the perimeter. Dig in. Hold the line. That was all the orders there were. They dug. The ground was rocky and hard, and every shovelful felt like it might be the last thing they did. but they dug because the alternative was dying above ground. By noon, they had a hole deep enough to crouch in, and that was enough. The Germans tried twice more to take the hill that day. Both times, the combined weight of American artillery and air power broke them. Not easily, not cleanly, but it broke them. And by the afternoon, the German advance had stalled. Callahan learned later what had happened. Operation Lüttich had been a gamble from the start, a desperate attempt by Hitler himself to cut off the American breakout and restore the German position in Normandy. 4 panzer divisions, the best armor Germany still had in the West, thrown against a thin American line with orders to reach the coast in 24 hours. The plan required speed. It required surprise. It required the Americans to break and run. But the Americans did not run. Companies like Callahan's, equipped with obsolete guns and impossible orders, stood in the fog and fought blind because there was no other choice. And they bought time. Hours. A day. Enough time for reinforcements to arrive, for air power to mobilize, for the strategic picture to shift. The cost was terrible. Company A, 823rd Tank Destroyer Battalion, ceased to exist as a fighting unit. Of the 6 gun crews that had entered the battle that morning, 2 survived intact. 16 men dead, 31 wounded, all 6 guns lost. The butcher's bill was paid in full. But Hill 314 held. Mortain did not fall completely. And Operation Lüttich, which should have shattered the American line and changed the course of the war, instead became the beginning of the end for the German army in France. Within 2 weeks, the Allies would close the Falaise pocket, trapping and destroying the remnants of 7 German divisions. The road to Paris would be open. The war would grind on for 9 more months, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Callahan spent 3 days on Hill 314 before they were relieved. 3 days of digging deeper, of burying friends, of watching the sky for planes and the tree line for tanks. When the relief column finally arrived, he walked down the hill with his surviving crew, and none of them spoke. There was nothing to say. They had done what was asked of them. They had stood when standing was impossible. They had fired blind into a fog full of death and somehow lived to see the other side. That was enough. In the years after the war, Callahan rarely spoke about Mortain. When people asked, he would say it was like any other battle, which was a lie, but a useful one. The truth was more complicated. The truth was that on the morning of August 7, 1944, the doctrine said his unit should have been annihilated in the first 30 minutes. The mathematics said that towed guns against heavy armor in close terrain was suicide. The strategic picture said that a handful of battalions could not delay 4 panzer divisions long enough to matter. But the men who fought there did not know the doctrine, did not trust the mathematics, and did not care about the strategic picture. They knew only that retreat meant death, advance was impossible, so the only option left was to stand and fight. And in that fog, in that impossible morning, they proved that courage and desperation could sometimes rewrite the equations that generals used to predict the outcome of battles. The story of Mortain is not well known. It does not have the dramatic arc of D-Day or the symbolic weight of the Bulge. It was a small battle, in a small sector, involving units that were never famous and men whose names were forgotten by everyone except their families. But history is not made only by famous battles and celebrated heroes. History is made by sergeants standing behind obsolete guns in the fog, by gunners who fire blind at shapes they cannot see, by crews who displace under fire knowing they will probably have to do it again in 5 minutes, by men who understand that their job is not to win but to delay, not to destroy but to endure. Mortain was a battle fought by men who knew they could not win and fought anyway because winning was not the point. Survival was the point. Time was the point. And they gave both, measured in blood and hours, enough to change the course of a campaign and perhaps a war. When Sergeant Robert Callahan died in 1997, his obituary mentioned that he had served in World War II. It did not mention Mortain. It did not mention the fog, the Panthers, the impossible odds. That is how most wars are remembered. The big moments get monuments. The small moments get silence. But the men who were there, the ones who survived, they remember. They remember the cold, the fear, the sound of engines in the darkness. They remember the friends who did not make it off the hill. They remember that once, when everything said they should die, they chose to stand instead. And that choice, multiplied across 100 small battles in 100 forgotten places, is what victory actually looks like. This story matters because it reminds us that wars are not won by grand strategies and overwhelming force alone. They are won by individuals making impossible choices in impossible situations. They are won by men like Robert Callahan, who stood behind a gun that could not save him and fired anyway. They are won in the fog, in the darkness, in the moments when the mathematics fail, and all that remains is the human will to resist. Mortain was not the most important battle of World War II. But for the men who fought there, it was the only battle that mattered. And for a few desperate hours, their refusal to break held the line long enough for history to turn. If you have stayed with this story to the end, then you understand something important. You understand that heroism is not always loud or celebrated. Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it is a group of exhausted men firing a gun they know cannot save them, buying minutes with their lives, standing because someone has to stand. These men deserve to be remembered. Their names deserve to be spoken. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the cost of freedom and the price of courage, then do something simple. Subscribe to this channel so more forgotten stories can be told. Leave a like if you believe these voices from the past still have something to teach us. And share your thoughts in the comments, because history is not a monologue. It is a conversation between the past and the present, between those who lived it and those who remember it. Here is a question to carry with you. When faced with impossible odds, when every rational calculation says that resistance is futile, what makes a person choose to stand and fight anyway? Is it duty? Is it loyalty to the men beside you? Is it something deeper, some part of the human spirit that refuses to accept the mathematics of defeat? The men at Mortain made that choice. They stood in the fog and fought blind, and in doing so, they became part of something larger than themselves. What would you do in that fog? What would any of us do? That is the question their story asks, and the answer, whatever it may be, is worth thinking about.